FBI Director Kash Patel is currently in the hot seat, and the dark secrets he admitted under oath could ultimately send both him and Donald Trump to federal prison. Incoming Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is leading a furious charge, demanding the immediate removal of President Trump from office, and he is not standing alone in this unprecedented political moment. The president is currently facing severe accusations of instigating violence and actively encouraging his supporters, who subsequently breached the United States Capitol building yesterday. Consequently, Senator Schumer is adamant that President Trump must be ousted from the White House, suggesting this be done either through the invocation of the 25th Amendment or by recalling Congress to impeach him once more. Schumer is adding his voice to a rapidly expanding roster of lawmakers and public officials who have formally declared the president entirely unfit to continue his service. Naturally, this monumental push is unfolding just weeks before President-elect Joe Biden is scheduled to be inaugurated. Adding to the bipartisan nature of these demands, Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois is joining the mounting calls for the swift removal of President Trump. Just a short time ago, Kinzinger posted a video clip on Twitter expressing his profound dismay. He stated that it became tragically evident yesterday that the president has not only relinquished his fundamental obligation to protect the American populace and the Capitol building, but he also deliberately inflamed passions that directly fueled the uprising witnessed by the nation. Kinzinger declared that it is time to deploy the 25th Amendment to bring this national nightmare to a close, noting that while the country will recover, the events that led to this point cannot be forgotten. The political landscape is shifting rapidly, with multiple impeachment resolutions being drafted, resolute demands for the 25th Amendment being issued, and well over 100 House Democrats demanding the president's immediate removal. Notably, Congressman Kinzinger's statement marked the first time a Republican House member called for the use of the 25th Amendment against the sitting president. It is crucial to understand that these are not mere political talking points, rather, they are formal, constitutional mechanisms being actively deployed in real time. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer are formally calling for President Trump to be stripped of his power. They are directly urging Vice President Mike Pence and other members of the presidential cabinet to step forward and invoke the 25th Amendment, even as the president has a mere 12 days remaining in his term. Democratic leaders are intensely pressuring the president's dwindling cabinet to act swiftly, declare him unfit to serve out the remainder of his term, and elevate Vice President Pence to the role of acting president. However, up to this point, they have secured no cooperation from the cabinet, and their urgent calls to Vice President Pence have reportedly gone unreturned. Because of this silence, lawmakers are actively developing a secondary strategy, declaring the situation an emergency of the highest possible magnitude. Speaker Pelosi has labeled President Trump as inherently dangerous and asserted he must be removed following the week's unrest at the Capitol. To grasp the gravity of the situation, one must look closely at what these drafted impeachment resolutions actually articulate. The resolution is highly specific and thoroughly detailed. It serves as a formal charging document that accuses President Trump of deeply impeachable conduct. The document explicitly states that Trump has grossly abused his presidential power, incited violence against sitting members of Congress, issued threats against the lives of lawmakers, and attacked federal judges in a manner that jeopardizes their personal safety. Furthermore, it alleges that he has actively undermined core democratic institutions and engaged in a pattern of behavior that, if permitted to continue unchecked, will inevitably dissolve the republic. These are the severe charges that members of Congress are formally bringing forward. They are making a constitutional argument that this conduct easily meets the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors, thereby warranting immediate impeachment and removal from office to safeguard American democracy. Legal scholars, including Professors Feldman, Carlin, and Gerhardt, have weighed in on this evidence, confirming that the president's actions constitute a definitive, impeachable act, specifically a high crime and misdemeanor rooted in the abuse of power. Professor Feldman clarifies that the United States Constitution grants the House of Representatives the sole and exclusive power of impeachment. This means it is the inherent right and solemn responsibility of the House to thoroughly investigate acts of presidential misconduct and, when deemed appropriate, to draft and pass articles of impeachment. Expanding on this, Professor Carlin emphasizes the immense weight of this responsibility. Because the president's actions represent an abuse that strikes at the very foundation of democracy, the committee must consider the consequences of inaction. Carlin argues that failing to investigate and subsequently impeach a president who has committed such acts essentially signals to future leaders that this type of destructive behavior is perfectly acceptable and can be repeated without consequence. The resolution does not shy away from specifics. It cites heavily documented examples to build its case. It references Trump's rhetoric regarding the execution of political opponents within Congress, his relentless attacks on the judiciary that resulted in federal judges receiving targeted death threats, and his overarching attempts to intimidate any lawmakers who dared to oppose his agenda. It outlines a much broader systemic pattern of the president utilizing the immense weight of his office to threaten anyone standing in his path. All of these actions are meticulously documented, cited as clear evidence of an impeachable abuse of power, and presented as the core justification for why Congress must intervene to remove him. This is far from a vague airing of political grievances. It is a rigid, formal constitutional accusation supported by a detailed ledger of specific allegations. Beyond the trajectory of impeachment, there is the separate avenue of the 25th Amendment. Chuck Schumer, acting as the Senate Democratic leader, has publicly demanded Trump's removal under this specific constitutional provision, arguing emphatically that the president is unfit to properly discharge the immense powers and duties associated with his office. Schumer stated that the president should not be permitted to hold his office for a single day longer. He argued that the absolute quickest and most effective method to remove the president today would be for the vice president to step up and immediately invoke the 25th Amendment. If the vice president and the cabinet refuse to take this action, Schumer insists that Congress must reconvene at once to impeach the president. David Weston, a prominent political anchor, noted that there are several potential motivations behind Schumer's urgent demands. While some might attribute it to standard partisan politics, others believe it stems from a genuine, profound fear of what the president might do during his final 13 days in power. The relevant question is whether lawmakers truly believe the president might take irrevocable actions that could permanently damage the nation before his term expires. Despite the urgency, invoking the 25th Amendment remains highly unlikely in practice. The process requires the vice president and a clear majority of the cabinet to act in unison, and these individuals are largely seen as Trump loyalists who are incredibly unlikely to suddenly turn against him. Nevertheless, the mere fact that a sitting U.S. senator is publicly and formally making this argument for a 25th Amendment removal is historically significant. It represents elected officials formally declaring that the president is so dangerously unfit that constitutional emergency powers must be immediately deployed. With over 100 House Democrats formally going on the record to demand Trump's removal, a lasting precedent is being set. Even if the current political reality, specifically Republican control of the Senate, makes actual removal highly improbable, the existence of this formal record is vital. It thoroughly documents that the president's own contemporaries viewed his conduct as deeply impeachable and chose to formally challenge it, generating a historical evidentiary record that future generations and accountability structures will simply not be able to ignore. To truly understand the congressional efforts aimed at removing President Trump, one must understand the distinct tools available, the various constitutional mechanisms at play, and the harsh political realities that dictate their chances of success. The first mechanism is impeachment. The Constitution dictates that a sitting president can be impeached for acts of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. This is a rigorous two-step process. First, the House of Representatives must vote to impeach, which functions similarly to a legal indictment. Passing these formal charges requires a simple majority vote. At this moment, Democrats do not hold the majority in the House. Republicans do. Therefore, passing any articles of impeachment would require either securing Republican crossover votes or waiting until a time when Democrats might retake the chamber in subsequent elections. However, the drafted resolutions are prepared and ready to be advanced should the political climate shift. Impeachment by the House is only the initial hurdle. If the House successfully votes to impeach, the case is then sent to the Senate for a formal trial. For the president to be convicted and forcibly removed, the Senate must vote with a 2/3 majority, which translates to 67 senators. Achieving this number is extraordinarily difficult, as it demands significant, robust bipartisan support. It would require a large number of Republicans to vote to remove a president from their own party, an event that has historically never occurred. President Trump was impeached twice during his first term, and both times the Senate failed to convict him. Even if the House were to impeach him yet again, securing a Senate conviction appears highly unlikely. Still, the physical filing of these resolutions and the leveling of formal charges continue to carry weight. They force lawmakers to take a definitive public stance and meticulously document the case for removal, even if the ultimate goal of removal is not achieved. The 25th Amendment represents an entirely different constitutional mechanism governed by a distinct process. Under Section 4 of the amendment, the Vice President and a majority of the President's cabinet have the authority to declare the President unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The moment they make this formal declaration, the Vice President immediately assumes the role of acting President. However, the President has the right to challenge this move and declare that he is, in fact, able to serve. At that juncture, the decision falls to Congress, which must vote with a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to keep the president removed from power. Failing that, the president resumes his office. The primary hurdle for the 25th Amendment is that it requires proactive cooperation from the vice president and the cabinet. It necessitates that they actively turn against the president who appointed them, a prospect that is politically grueling. These are individuals chosen specifically for their deep loyalty to the president, and their own political careers often hinge on his continued support. In this specific case, the vice president and the cabinet are known as staunch Trump loyalists. Consequently, they are incredibly unlikely to invoke the amendment or declare him unfit, regardless of how many senators or House Democrats demand it. Without their initial agreement, the 25th Amendment process cannot even begin. Therefore, while a sitting senator's call for its use is a historically significant formal demand, it does not represent a realistic, viable path to removal given the current political environment. Despite these insurmountable political realities, all three primary mechanisms for removal impeachment, the 25th Amendment, and resignation are being formally invoked and pursued. They all crash into the same immovable political wall. Republicans maintain control of Congress, the cabinet consists of dedicated loyalists, and President Trump is entirely unwilling to voluntarily resign. Yet, the simple fact that elected officials are drafting actual resolutions and issuing formal demands creates a permanent, indelible record. It cements the reality that his conduct was formally recognized as impeachable by his peers, even if political barriers ultimately prevented his ousting. A closer examination of the specific charges laid out in the impeachment resolution reveals that it is not a document of general political whining. It cites exact terrifying conduct. For instance, it highlights the president's rhetoric calling for the execution of his political opponents within Congress. This is not an exaggeration. It references actual statements he made advocating for the death of elected representatives. The resolution argues that such rhetoric constitutes clear incitement of violence and a gross abuse of power that is inherently impeachable. The document also meticulously chronicles the president's sustained attacks on federal judges. It outlines how Trump has used his platform to personally attack members of the judiciary who rule against his interests, and how those specific verbal assaults have directly resulted in judges receiving credible death threats. The resolution notes that a significant portion of the federal judiciary reported being overwhelmed by threatening communications, explicitly connecting this dangerous climate of violence directly back to the president's aggressive rhetoric. Furthermore, the resolution makes a forward-looking argument. It asserts that Trump will undoubtedly continue this destructive conduct if permitted to remain in power. It alleges he will persistently work to undermine democracy, incite further violence, abuse his executive power, and attack any institution or individual attempting to check his authority. This pattern of ongoing, relentless abuse forms the core of the impeachment argument. The drafters are making the case that Trump is not merely making isolated, unfortunate mistakes, rather he is engaging in systematic, calculated abuse. He is wielding the immense power of the presidency in a manner that actively threatens democratic institutions and the personal safety of individuals. The resolution concludes that this systematic abuse demands his immediate removal to secure the survival of the republic. Understanding the political dynamics surrounding these removal efforts is essential. Even though the constitutional mechanisms exist and the formal resolutions have been carefully drafted and filed, political reality renders actual removal highly improbable. Republicans maintain a firm grip on Congress and remain largely loyal to the president. Throughout his tenure, Trump has showcased a unique ability to maintain an iron grip on his base within the Republican Party, surviving countless scandals, impeachments, and behavior that would have easily destroyed the careers of traditional politicians. Republican members of Congress, even those who harbor deep private concerns regarding the president's extreme conduct, are highly unlikely to cross the aisle to vote for impeachment, publicly support the 25th Amendment, or demand his resignation. Taking such a stand would instantly infuriate Trump's passionate base, invite aggressive primary challenges, and likely spell the end of their political careers. Privately, many Republicans acknowledge that his behavior is deeply problematic, but their primal instinct for political survival binds them to him. However, slight fractures in this armor do exist. If the president were to cross a line so undeniably extreme that it becomes impossible to defend, those quiet, private concerns could rapidly morph into public, decisive action. The necessary groundwork for impeachment is already firmly in place. The resolutions are filed and the constitutional arguments have been thoroughly articulated. They are simply waiting for a vote should the political climate ever align. The driving force behind these urgent removal efforts stems from the very real danger lawmakers are facing. The president has aggressively attacked members of Congress on a personal level, branding them as traitors, suggesting they deserve execution, and actively encouraging his massive base of supporters to target them. Consequently, members of Congress are living in a state of heightened fear, receiving death threats, navigating severe security concerns, and dealing daily with the toxic, violent climate the president has fostered. By filing these resolutions, they are declaring that they have had enough. They're asserting that a commander-in-chief who threatens the lives of lawmakers is inherently impeachable, instantly disqualified from holding office, and must be removed. A functioning democracy dictates that elected representatives must be able to execute their duties safely without the looming terror of presidential incitement against them. Similarly, federal judges who have ruled against the president's interests have faced their own terrifying waves of death threats and intimidation tactics, clearly designed to forcefully influence legal outcomes through sheer fear. Members of Congress view this as the president weaponizing his platform to obliterate judicial independence. They argue this behavior is also undeniably impeachable, representing a flagrant abuse of power and a direct assault on the separation of power. If allowed to continue unchecked, they warn it will dismantle constitutional government entirely. This fits into a much broader, deeply concerning pattern of the president systematically undermining democratic institutions. He ruthlessly attacks the integrity of elections when he loses, attacks the courts when they issue unfavorable rulings, attacks Congress when it attempts to provide oversight, and attacks the media whenever they dare to criticize him. He attacks absolutely anyone who stands in his way. This systematic, relentless assault on the pillars of democracy is the true engine driving the calls for his removal. Lawmakers are emphasizing that this is not standard everyday political friction. This is a president actively attempting to dismantle all structural checks on his power, eliminate all forms of accountability, and forge an authoritarian environment where he operates completely above the law and beyond institutional constraints. These removal efforts are not merely partisan games or examples of Democrats acting as obstructionists. They are deeply genuine constitutional responses to behavior that lawmakers find existentially threatening to the survival of democracy. They represent desperate attempts to utilize the few available tools to rein in presidential abuse. While the stark political reality makes ultimate success unlikely, the efforts themselves hold immense intrinsic value. They meticulously document the abuse, establish a permanent historical record, and prove that the president's own contemporaries viewed his actions as utterly disqualifying. Furthermore, they preserve these rare constitutional mechanisms just in case the political landscape shifts dramatically enough to make removal a viable option. Impeachment and the 25th Amendment are not casual political maneuvers. They are extraordinary, historically rare constitutional levers. When lawmakers take the step to formally invoke them, even with the knowledge that they will likely fail, it serves as a profound statement that the president's actions have crossed a threshold requiring responses rarely seen in the entirety of American history. The fact that formal impeachment resolutions sit on file, that over 100 Democrats demand removal, and that senators are calling for the 25th Amendment reveals a critical truth. The president has engaged in behavior that a massive portion of Congress finds completely disqualifying. While a deep partisan divide continues to protect him and Republicans largely refuse to join the effort, the mere invocation of these mechanisms demonstrates that Trump's conduct has escalated far beyond normal political disagreement. It has entered a dangerous territory where the most extreme constitutional tools suddenly become highly relevant. The documentation function of these efforts cannot be overstated. Even if they fail to remove the president, they generate an undeniable record. The formal charging document exists, carefully preserved within the congressional record. It will forever remain available to historians, future legal prosecutors, and anyone seeking to examine the realities of this presidency. This documentation establishes a contemporaneous, real-time record of the president's abuses, proving that elected officials recognized the immense danger while it was actively unfolding. It ensures that the acknowledgement of his unfitness was not merely a product of historical hindsight, but a reality recognized in the moment by those uniquely positioned to observe it. While immediate removal may be unlikely right now, that is not entirely the point. Every single resolution filed, every demand for the 25th Amendment, and every call for resignation inflicts narrative damage and builds political pressure. It constructs a ready-made framework that can be activated instantly if Republicans ever determine that continuing to defend the president is politically costlier than removing him. Furthermore, there is a crucial deterrent effect to consider. These removal efforts, even in failure, firmly establish that certain extreme behaviors will trigger an aggressive congressional response. They establish that threatening lawmakers or attacking the judiciary are definitively impeachable offenses. Future presidents, looking back at these formal congressional actions, might be successfully deterred from engaging in similar conduct, understanding that crossing those specific lines will invite serious legal and political jeopardy. In this way, the efforts serve an essential educational function, clearly defining boundaries and expectations for future leaders, even if the current leader escapes immediate consequence. There is, however, a profound asymmetry problem at the heart of this crisis. The president's most ardent supporters do not care about these removal efforts, dismissing them entirely as illegitimate partisan witch hunts. Even though serious formal constitutional mechanisms are being utilized to address grave charges, the base ignores it completely. This dynamic is deeply corrosive to the fabric of democracy. It breeds immense frustration, creating a terrifying sense that true accountability is entirely impossible, that regardless of the severity of a president's actions, tribal political loyalty will always shield them from consequences. It causes the public to lose faith in the very mechanisms of accountability, suggesting that raw power is the only thing that matters and that rules simply do not apply to leaders who can maintain their political base. Yet, despite this cynical reality, the efforts to remove the president still matter immensely. They preserve vital constitutional norms, ensuring that blatant abuse is formally recognized and forcefully challenged, even when political tribalism blocks the final consequence. This detailed record will inevitably outlast the current administration. It will stand ready for when circumstances evolve, documenting for the harsh lens of history exactly what the president did and exactly how the legislative branch chose to respond. This historical accounting holds immense intrinsic value. It establishes undeniable truth, preserves critical evidence, and actively prevents the rise of revisionist history that might eventually attempt to paint the president's extreme conduct as normal or acceptable. This leaves the nation in a precarious position. We are witnessing multiple impeachment resolutions charging a sitting president with high crimes, senators demanding 25th Amendment removal, and over 100 House Democrats pushing for immediate resignation. We see formal constitutional tools being deployed against the sitting leader based on highly specific documented abuses. Yet, simultaneously, we are paralyzed by a political reality that makes actual removal nearly impossible. Republican control blocks impeachment votes, absolute cabinet loyalty nullifies the 25th Amendment, and the president's own defiance guarantees he will not resign. This is the fundamental tension of this era. The constitutional tools exist, the grave charges have been filed, and serious efforts are underway, yet political tribalism prevents them from succeeding. This failure raises terrifying questions about the viability of accountability itself. It forces the nation to ask whether these constitutional mechanisms can ever truly work if a dangerously unfit president simply maintains enough partisan backing. It questions whether a democracy can physically survive when half the population views these removal efforts as essential and legitimate, while the other half dismisses them as a purely partisan sham. These questions offer no easy answers and present no simple solutions. They merely highlight a profound dysfunction, a complete breakdown of national consensus regarding what constitutes acceptable presidential behavior. It highlights a severe crisis of democratic governance where loyalty to a political tribe outweighs respect for institutional norms. Nevertheless, the relentless removal efforts continue. New resolutions are drafted, new public calls are made, and new lawmakers consistently add their voices to the growing chorus demanding accountability. Because even when ultimate success appears politically impossible, the effort itself is crucial. The rigorous documentation matters. The formal invocation of the highest constitutional mechanisms matters. It firmly establishes that the president's abuses did not go unnoticed. They were actively challenged and met with a severe constitutional response, regardless of the final outcome. The record now exists. The case for removal has been thoroughly established. This stubborn preservation of constitutional norms and the unwavering insistence on accountability, even in the face of inevitable failure, matters deeply for the long-term survival of democracy. It preserves the fundamental American ideal that gross presidential misconduct should, in theory, carry heavy consequences. It maintains the standards of the office, acting as a beacon for a future time when political realities might shift and true accountability might once again become a possibility. These ongoing removal efforts have successfully drawn a roadmap and built a framework. They have assembled charges, evidence, and constitutional arguments that lie dormant, ready to be immediately activated if the political winds ever change, if Republicans ever turn on him, if public pressure reaches a boiling point, or if unforeseen events force their hand. The resolutions exist, the 25th Amendment demands are documented, and the calls for resignation are permanently on the record. They are all preserved as undeniable evidence of the president's unfitness, waiting for the moment when accountability aligns with political possibility. This is the stark reality of the situation. The formal constitutional efforts to remove President Trump are happening, they are entirely real, and they are incredibly serious. However, they remain blocked by immense political obstacles. They are highly documented, yet ultimately unsuccessful in their immediate goal. They stand as vital acts for the historical record and for the preservation of democratic principles in the future, even as they fail to remove the president in the present. This is the nature of the congressional revolt against the president. It is real but heavily constrained, deeply formal but consistently frustrated, historically significant yet practically unsuccessful. Yet, all of it works together to create a permanent, glaring record of abuse and response, preserving the vital norms of the Constitution and waiting patiently for the day when political reality might change and removal might finally become possible. We will see what happens.